Good night. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where silence wasn't awkward. It was powerful. Where a folded corner on a calling card could decide your fate, and a single wobble in your curtsy was enough to doom your family's entire social strategy. Welcome to the Gilded Age, a place where fortunes sparkled, reputations shattered, and survival depended on mastering an etiquette so complicated it made assembling IKEA furniture look mercifully simple. Because here, words were almost optional. What really mattered were the unspoken signals, the depth of a bow, the flick of a fan, the placement of a flower in your bouquet. A well-timed glance could launch a courtship, while the wrong type of cardstock could get you erased from every guest list in town. Think of it as social media without the Wi-Fi, reputations built and destroyed, all through whispers, gestures, and the occasional strategically dropped handkerchief. On one side of the Atlantic, British aristocrats clung to centuries of rituals, convinced that their rigid codes kept civilization from collapsing. On the other, America's nouveau riches threw balls so flamboyant that Paris couture houses practically set up branch offices in New York. But whether you were in Mayfair or Manhattan, the rules were the same. Obey the codes or prepare to be socially ghosted long before ghosting was fashionable. So settle back. Imagine yourself beneath chandeliers blazing in 1890, surrounded by perfume, whispers, and far too many ostrich feathers. Tonight, we'll decode the hidden language of the Gilded Age, a world where everyone claimed to be having fun, but in truth, most were playing the most stressful game of charades ever invented. The Gilded Age was a time when money grew so fast it practically sprouted on trees, or more accurately, on steel rails, oil wells, and stock certificates. In America, fortunes ballooned almost overnight. Men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt made sums so obscene they could have personally bailed out for half of Europe on a slow Tuesday. Across the Atlantic, things looked different. Britain's aristocracy still lounged on centuries of hereditary privilege. Titles so ancient, they seemed less like names and more like minor geological formations. But whether your wealth came from coal mines or from an ancestor who once lent money to Henry VIII, both societies agreed on one thing. The masses needed to be kept at arm's length. And how do you separate yourself from the common crowd? Not by walls or gates, well, not only by those, but by a labyrinth of social codes so intricate that only insiders could possibly keep up. It was a kind of invisible moat. In this world, everything mattered. Who you spoke to, how deep you bowed, how loudly you laughed. Even removing your gloves had to be timed properly. It wasn't simply good manners, it was survival. A misplaced glance could be interpreted as insolence. A greeting offered too casually could ruin your family's carefully curated reputation. And the punishments were swift. Invitations evaporated. Whispered gossip ensured that your name became shorthand for bad form. It was social cancellation long before Twitter was invented. The cruel irony? Everyone was constantly watching, judging, and decoding, while pretending not to. Polite society was essentially one long poker game in which the stakes weren't chips but reputations. The goal was to appear effortlessly elegant, even if you'd spent 3 days rehearsing how to hand someone a card without dropping it. The truth is, the Gilded Age didn't need reality television. They were living it. If the drawing room was a battlefield, then courtship was the trickiest campaign of all. Romance in the Gilded Age was not a matter of chemistry or serendipity. It was a choreographed dance in which directness was considered not charming but borderline scandalous. Imagine trying to flirt while a chaperone sat 3 feet away, knitting with the intensity of a security guard. That was the baseline. In Britain, rules were ironclad. Young ladies never went anywhere without a chaperone, preferably an aunt who had forgotten what smiling looked like. A lady might signal interest in a suitor by dropping her handkerchief, But heaven forbid she actually speak the words, "I like you." And the last waltz of the evening. That was as close to a marriage proposal as things got in public. If a man was bold enough or foolish enough to claim it, whispers would fly before the music even ended. Across the Atlantic, Americans were just as committed to codes, but with a little more flair and significantly larger budgets. The Astors and Vanderbilts threw balls so lavish that Paris fashion houses were on speed dial. Flirtations were carefully staged. The exchange of calling cards, the accidental bump in Central Park carriages, or the engineered introduction at a ball where everyone already knew exactly why you were there. American hostesses were bolder, not just arranging matches, but practically writing the scripts. Think of them as the original reality show producers, only with more tiaras and less editing. Direct affection was discouraged everywhere, but that didn't mean young people lacked creativity. A fan snapped shut too quickly could be a rejection. A glove dropped accidentally could be an invitation. It was like texting emojis, except you needed a manual to understand what they meant. And your future happiness depended on not confusing a wink for a grimace. The dry truth? It wasn't love at first sight. It was love at first successfully interpreted gesture. Courtship was less Romeo and Juliet and more The Hunger Games, only with ostrich feathers instead of weapons. Now let's talk about the business cards of the Gilded Age, the calling card. Today, you can add someone on LinkedIn in 3 seconds. Back then, securing social connection required a piece of heavy paper, precise typography, and nerves of steel. A calling card was not just a rectangle with your name on it. It was a statement. The thickness of the card, the curve of the font, the whiteness of the paper, all of these things spoke volumes about who you were, or more importantly, who you wanted people to think you were. Too flimsy, and you looked cheap. Too ornate, and you looked desperate. It was, in short, the equivalent of choosing the wrong Instagram filter and losing all credibility. The ritual went like this. You approached the house, offered your card to the butler, and waited while he carried it off on a silver tray. The card would then be presented to the lady of the house, who could accept it, reject it, or, worst of all, pretend she never saw it. Each decision carried layers of meaning, entire conversations compressed into gestures. But cards could also be tweaked to deliver coded messages. A folded corner meant a personal visit. An underlined name expressed congratulations. A black border meant you were in mourning. These were the original status updates, but with higher stakes and better paper quality. In Britain, the whole ritual was suffocatingly precise. Etiquette manuals dictated when, how, and to whom cards should be left. Woe betide the person who dared leave a card for a duchess uninvited. It was the 19th century equivalent of cold calling a celebrity. In America, meanwhile, calling cards were weapons for the ambitious. Mrs. Caroline Astor's drawing room was the Everest of acceptance. If your card landed there, and stayed there, you were officially part of the 400, the golden circle of New York society. Everyone else was merely pretending. The truth is, calling cards were less about making friends and more about keeping score. Each exchange was a move in the endless game of social chess. Today, you might track followers and likes. In 1890, they tracked who had left their card where, and whose card had been left unanswered. And honestly, the drama was just as delicious. If you think sitting at the wrong end of the cafeteria table in high school was painful, imagine the Gilded Age dinner party, where your place at the table wasn't just about eating, it was a proclamation of your worth as a human being. Seating was a kind of social MRI. It revealed everything people really thought about you, without anyone having to say a word. In Britain, centuries of tradition dictated it all. The host and hostess sat at opposite ends of a long candlelit table, presiding over their guests like benevolent monarchs. The closer you were seated to them, the higher your social importance. Dukes and duchesses claimed the coveted positions near the host. Lower down, you might find baronets, colonels, or the unlucky wealthy industrialist who, despite owning half the railroads in northern England, still lacked the bloodlines to sit near the centre. At the far end, the nobodies, people so socially insignificant that they were practically dining in another time zone. It went deeper than that. Men of rank were seated beside women of corresponding prestige. The wrong pairing, a duke beside a debutante whose family had only recently clawed their way into society, could trigger scandalous whispers before the soup course even arrived. A hostess who bungled her seating plan risked being ridiculed for months, her taste and judgment questioned as though she'd committed treason. Imagine the stress of a wedding planner multiplied by every single meal. In America, the rules were newer, but no less vicious. Here, money was the great equalizer, but it still needed translation into status. A seat near Mrs. Astor or Alva Vanderbilt was worth more than a year's subscription to the New York Times. Guests angled for places where they could be photographed by gossip columnists, or at least observed by rivals. Who sat next to whom was not random. It was matchmaking, networking, and social warfare rolled into one. A railroad baron might be seated beside a European countess, part flattery, part business deal, part rumour waiting to happen. And the absurdity? Entire reputations turned on this invisible choreography. If you were seated too far from the host, everyone assumed you were slipping down the social ladder. Too close, and others muttered that you'd pulled strings. Today we worry about who viewed our Instagram story. In 1890, you worried about whether your seat placement implied your fortune was collapsing. Either way, everyone was watching. Now, as if the verbal and written codes weren't enough, the Gilded Age elite insisted on inventing an entirely different language, one spoken through flowers. This was floriography, the so-called language of flowers, and it made bouquets into secret telegrams disguised as table decor. A red rose didn't just mean romance, it screamed passion. A white camellia expressed admiration. A sprig of heliotrope whispered eternal devotion. A yellow carnation? Utter disdain. Yes, disdain. Imagine someone handing you a bunch of flowers that basically said, "I can't stand you." That was entirely possible in 1890. Debutantes carried small deliberate posies to balls, each bloom chosen like words in a poem. Did she favour the gentleman with violets? Admiration. Did she tuck a sprig of marigold into her bouquet? Congratulations, he had just been told, silently, to keep walking. And heaven help the girl who misarranged her bouquet, because society had a sharp memory for meanings. In Britain, the codes were treated with almost religious seriousness. Manuals like The Language and Poetry of Flowers by Frances Osgood sold briskly, so every well-bred lady could memorise the symbolic lexicon. It was essentially Duolingo, but for decoding your neighbour's bouquet instead of ordering tapas in Spanish. In America, however, subtlety was not the order of the day. If British ladies whispered through tiny posies, American hostesses screamed through florists' invoices. Alva Vanderbilt was notorious for filling entire ballrooms with themed arrangements, orchids for exotic taste, roses for power, lilies for moral superiority. By morning, the flowers had wilted, but the coded messages lingered. Of course, the entire system was ripe for disaster. There are stories of young men sending bouquets of red roses, only to discover they had been interpreted as vulgar displays of lust. Others accidentally sent combinations of flowers that suggested hatred when they had been aiming for admiration. One careless florist could ruin an engagement. Think of it as autocorrect, but with orchids. The truth is, flowers were never just flowers. They were weapons, decorations, and secret diaries rolled into one. Today, we send emojis. Back then, you risked your entire social standing on the arrangement of petunias. And yes, that was considered completely normal. If flowers and seating weren't exhausting enough, clothing added yet another layer of silent communication. In the Gilded Age, what you wore wasn't simply fashion. It was your resume, your credit score, and your Tinder profile all stitched into fabric. Men had it easier, though not by much. The cut of a gentleman's coat, the crispness of his shirt front, even the shine of his boots sent signals about his breeding and financial stability. Gloves were mandatory, but removing them at the wrong time, scandalous. A handshake with bare hands could imply intimacy, and not the good kind. For women, the rules bordered on insanity. Every gown conveyed status. A neckline cut too low in Britain was vulgar. The same neckline in America was considered daring and fashionable. British aristocrats leaned toward conservatism, understated fabrics, muted jewels, always erring on the side of restraint. Across the ocean, however, restraint was practically a sin. American society women bought gowns from Charles Frederick Worth in Paris, dresses so extravagant they required trunks the size of coffins just to ship them. Sequins, pearls, towering tiaras, sweeping trains that required multiple maids to manage. A single gown could cost as much as a servant's yearly wages, and heaven forbid it was ever repeated. The absurdities were endless. Wearing diamonds before marriage? Forbidden. That was for married women. Debutantes were restricted to pearls, lest they appear too ambitious. Wearing the wrong jewel could brand you as desperate. Hats at Ascot were judged not by elegance but by altitude. The taller, the better. One lady's hat was so enormous, it reportedly blocked 3 rows of spectators. Naturally, everyone applauded. And then there were the unwritten codes about repetition. To wear the same gown twice to major events was social death. Imagine your Instagram feed showing you in the same dress at 2 different galas. The whispers would be merciless. Women scheduled fittings daily. Seamstresses worked themselves into exhaustion, and still the pressure never ended. Gowns were not made for comfort. They were made to bankrupt fathers, torture maids, and terrify rivals. The truth is, fashion was ammunition. Every tiara was a crown of ambition, every train a banner of conquest. Today we complain about dress codes at weddings. In 1890, one wrong ruffle could cost you a duke. If the Gilded Age had a most famous export, it wasn't steel, oil, or even champagne. It was daughters, specifically American heiresses with bulging dowries and very determined mothers. They crossed the Atlantic armed with trunks full of Worth gowns, jewellery that could outshine a chandelier, and the desperate hope of marrying into British aristocracy. These young women were known, sometimes cruelly, sometimes enviously, as dollar princesses. The term wasn't meant kindly. To the British elite, it suggested brashness and vulgarity, as if these women were barging into centuries of tradition, armed with nothing but cash. And in a sense they were. The dukes, marquises and earls had the titles, the country estates, and the dusty family portraits. What they didn't have was money, at least not enough of it to repair leaky roofs, modernise plumbing, or, frankly, pay their staff. So while the British sniffed at American informality, they also quietly extended invitations. After all, a Vanderbilt dowry was more reliable than an ancient title when it came to fixing the roof of a crumbling castle. The culture shock was real. American high society had its codes, but it was flamboyant, bold, and relatively forgiving. A daring neckline might cause a few raised eyebrows in Newport, but in London, it was practically grounds for exile. American women laughed too loudly, spoke too freely, and, heaven forbid, sometimes even expressed opinions. In British society, this was akin to juggling flaming torches at a funeral. Take Jenny Jerome, for example, the American beauty who became Lady Randolph Churchill and the mother of Winston Churchill. She charmed men, sparkled at dinner tables, and wielded independence like a weapon. To some British matrons, she was thrilling. To others, she was a walking scandal. Then there was Consuelo Vanderbilt, perhaps the most famous dollar princess, married off to the Duke of Marlborough by her iron-willed mother, Alva Vanderbilt. Consuelo brought with her a dowry of $2.5 million, roughly $80 million today, and the crushing realization that her new life at Blenheim Palace was less romantic fairy tale and more unpaid internship in aristocratic misery. In her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, Consuelo describes feeling like a pawn, smothered by rules so alien they might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. American women were bewildered by British rituals, endless country house weekends where your entire worth was measured by where you sat at breakfast, or hunting parties where failure to wear the right tweed was considered a moral failing. Gail McColl's To Marry an English Lord is basically a survival manual detailing how many of these women floundered, gasped, and occasionally triumphed in their attempt to convert dollars into titles. The irony, for all their complaints, many of these marriages succeeded in propping up the aristocracy for another generation. The Americans got titles, castles, and status. The British got central heating, plumbing, and enough money to pretend the empire was still thriving. It was less romance, more merger, less weddings, more corporate acquisition. Think of it as Downton Abbey, but with Wall Street lawyers and mothers who could make Kris Jenner look shy. As if handkerchiefs, flowers, and seating charts weren't enough, the Gilded Age invented yet another silent code, the language of fans. Yes, the very same feathered or lace fans meant to keep you from fainting under the weight of 20 pounds of satin were also social weapons. Manuals circulated explaining precisely how to communicate without ever moving your lips. It was the 19th century version of subtweeting, petty, indirect, and endlessly entertaining. A fan held open in the left hand. Yes, a fan dropped on the floor. We are being watched. Fanning slowly meant you were already married. Fanning quickly meant you were engaged. Closing it abruptly in someone's direction. That was the social equivalent of swiping left and blocking their number. Of course, mastering this fan language required hours of practice. Imagine teenage debutantes rehearsing in front of mirrors, trying to flick their wrists just so, while their mothers shouted reminders from across the room. No, darling, that flick means you detest him. Try again. And like any code system, it was ripe for mistakes. One enthusiastic wave of the fan might accidentally announce eternal devotion to the wrong gentleman, triggering rumours that spread faster than you could snap the fan shut again. Think of it as sending a heart emoji to the wrong chat, except instead of mild embarrassment, you risked becoming the scandal of the season. Seating at dinner was already treacherous, but surviving the actual meal was its own endurance test. Dining in the Gilded Age was less about eating and more about performing. You weren't there to fill your stomach. You were there to show that you knew precisely which fork to use for the fish course, and that you could balance a spoonful of turtle soup without slurping. Formal dinners stretched for up to 12 courses, each with its own glass, fork and spoon. If you think modern tasting menus are over the top, imagine being served oysters, consommé, fish roast, game, pastries, sorbet, and fruit. Each dish requiring a different piece of silverware laid out like a miniature armoury in front of you. One wrong move, and you revealed yourself as a barbarian. There were rules for everything. Napkins had to be unfolded at exactly the right moment. Bread was to be broken, never cut. And don't even think about reaching for salt. That implied the cook hadn't seasoned the dish properly, which was an insult to your host. Conversation was equally policed. Talk only to the person on your left for the first course, then switch to the person on your right. Imagine toggling between dinner partners like an awkward dating app. The absurdity didn't stop there. In Britain, dinner was expected to last until the men withdrew for cigars, leaving the ladies to gossip over tea. In America, the pace was even more exhausting. with hostesses timing every course so perfectly that guests sometimes describe dinners as military campaigns with gravy. Today, we post pictures of our meals. Back then, they turned eating into a test so nerve-wracking that most guests probably went home hungry. For all their opulence, Gilded Age fashions were walking hazards. Corsets cut off circulation, bustles snagged on furniture, trains trailed like tripwires, and hats. Well, hats were practically weapons. There's at least one recorded case of a woman's ostrich feather plume catching fire from a candlelit chandelier. Another lady's tiara slipped off mid-curtsy and rolled across the palace floor like a rogue croquet ball. Trains were a menace in themselves. One misstep by a careless dance partner and an entire Worth gown could be ruined. Servants had to shadow their mistresses, scooping up fabric before it dragged through coal dust or candle wax. Picture a red carpet dress malfunction. But instead of paparazzi, you had 500 gossip-hungry aristocrats watching every stumble. Even fans and gloves weren't safe. A glove split at the seam could suggest you were careless with your appearance, while a fan snapped in two mid-flirtation could brand you a laughingstock. And since repeating an outfit was unthinkable, one major mishap meant another gown had to be rushed from Paris at ruinous cost. The absurdity was endless. Hats at Ascot were judged not for elegance but for altitude, leading one unfortunate woman to topple sideways when her headpiece proved heavier than expected. Imagine fainting in public not from heat or nerves, but from millinery ambition. Dry truth. For every glamorous portrait we admire today, there were a dozen whispered stories of ripped seams, singed feathers, and fainting fits. Fashion may have been ammunition, but sometimes it backfired spectacularly. What made the Gilded Age endlessly fascinating was how different the codes looked on either side of the Atlantic. In Britain, understatement was the golden rule. Subtle gestures, soft voices, and rituals so rigid they bordered on parody. At country house weekends, guests worried less about who they were talking to and more about which hunting coat they had packed. Wearing the wrong tweed was practically treason. Americans, meanwhile, thrived on excess. Where Britain whispered, America shouted. British hostesses arranged discreet luncheons. American hostesses threw balls that lit up entire city blocks. British women wore pearls for débutantes and diamonds only for married women. American heiresses piled both on at once and added a tiara for good measure. The contrast was stark. In Britain, a misstep was judged with silent disapproval. In America, it was splashed across the gossip pages the next morning. British aristocrats claimed they valued tradition. Americans valued spectacle. Yet both were obsessed with the same thing: visibility and survival. And when the two worlds collided, as they did with the dollar princesses, the results were often comical. British dukes grimaced at American exuberance, even as they cashed the dowry checks. American brides fumed at British restraint, even as they learned to curtsy like their lives depended on it. The truth? Neither side had it right. The British codes were suffocating, the American flamboyance exhausting, but together they created a Gilded Age social scene, so absurdly elaborate that it still feels like satire. It was, in essence, Bridgerton with more coal smoke. For all the glitter of the Gilded Age, the people who really saw it all weren't the dukes or the debutantes. They were the servants. Butlers, footmen, ladies' maids, and cooks were the silent stagehands of this exhausting theatre. They dressed the actors, polished the props, and cleaned up after the curtain fell. And they noticed everything. Take the butler. He wasn't just a glorified waiter. He was the guardian of social codes. When you left a calling card, it was the butler who judged whether your paper was thick enough, your font elegant enough, and your timing acceptable. A raised eyebrow from him could doom your chances before your hostess even saw the card. Think of him as the algorithm behind society's Instagram feed, deciding what got seen and what was quietly discarded. Footmen were judged by height. The taller, the better, as though aristocratic households were recruiting basketball teams before the sport was invented. They carried trays up and down endless staircases, calves bulging under their uniforms, while silently noting who flirted with whom and which guest overindulged in champagne. Many footmen fed gossip to newspapers for a tidy side income. After all, if you've spent all night polishing spoons, you may as well earn a bonus by telling a reporter which duke slipped into whose carriage. Ladies' maids had their own battlefield. They ironed gowns that wrinkled the second their mistresses sat down. They laced corsets so tight they risked breaking ribs, and they were often the first to hear whispered complaints. Does this gown make me look desperate? Will these pearls outshine Lady So-and-so? Maids were the therapists of the Gilded Age, with the added chore of sewing on sequins until their fingers bled. Dry truth. Servants were the real influencers. They saw the unfiltered version of society, messy, flawed and desperate, and without them, the entire edifice of unspoken codes would have collapsed. Upstairs there was champagne. Downstairs there was chaos. The beauty of a society built on unspoken rules is that the smallest slip could ignite a scandal. And scandal in the Gilded Age was delicious currency. One hostess reportedly seated a wealthy American banker too close to a duke at a London dinner. The duke left in a huff, muttering about vulgar colonials. The banker's family, meanwhile, never recovered socially, despite still owning more railroads than the duke could pronounce. Another tale involves a debutante who misread the language of flowers. She sent a bouquet heavy with yellow carnations, intending to express joy. Unfortunately, yellow carnations meant disdain. By the time she realised, rumours had already spread that she had publicly rejected her suitor. The poor girl spent an entire season ostracised, her family forced to stage even more extravagant dinners to claw their way back. And then there were the Americans abroad. Jenny Jerome scandalised the British not by anything she said, but by laughing too loudly at a hunting weekend. Unladylike, they sniffed. Meanwhile, Alva Vanderbilt was mocked for building a ballroom so enormous that people joked it could house an entire regiment. The irony? Everyone still wanted an invitation. Dry truth. These scandals weren't fatal in a literal sense, but socially they were worse. You didn't lose your life, you lost your invitations. And for the Gilded Age elite, that was practically the same thing. If you think today's influencers live and die by algorithms, spare a thought for the Gilded Age elite, who lived under the iron grip of the gossip columns. Newspapers like the Morning Post, the Times, and later the New York Times chronicled every dinner, every ball, every seating plan in painful detail. Being mentioned glowingly, Miss So-and-so dazzled in a gown of white satin and pearls, meant your calendar filled overnight. Being omitted was a death sentence, and worse still, a pointed remark like, Miss So-and-so was absent from the ball, was the genteel way of announcing your exile. It was shadow banning, but with ink. Some families even paid reporters to ensure their names appeared in print. Others lived in fear of omissions, reading the society pages over breakfast with the same intensity we check notifications today. A missing name caused panic. Was it a mistake? Or had you been silently cut from the guest list of life? The columns didn't just record events, they shaped them. A glowing description of a debutante's gown could elevate her chances of marriage. A sly mention of an unfortunate stumble could sink them. Entire fortunes were made or lost on the ink of a society journalist, many of whom were fed tidbits by the servants who saw everything. Modern comparison. Today we obsess over likes, comments and followers. Back then they obsessed over column inches and adjectives. Same game, different platform. And so we reach the end of our little tour through the invisible rulebook of the Gilded Age. A world where fans whispered secrets, flowers carried grudges, and a dinner invitation was as valuable as a stock portfolio, where marriages were arranged with more subtlety than mergers, and where survival wasn't about fortune alone, but about decoding 1,000 tiny signals no one ever admitted existed. Looking back, the unspoken social codes of the Gilded Age seem almost ridiculous. Entire fortunes and reputations balanced on the tilt of a fan, the border of a calling card, or the altitude of a hat at Ascot. It was a world where gestures carried more meaning than words, where every action was weighed, measured, and decoded by an audience pretending not to stare. And yet within this absurdity lay something deeply serious. These codes were the glue that held the upper classes together. They defined who was in and who was out, who was worthy of an invitation and who was consigned to obscurity. They shaped marriages, fortunes, and dynasties. A misstep wasn't just embarrassing, it was ruinous. It's easy to laugh now. After all, who cares if your bouquet accidentally suggested disdain instead of devotion? Who panics about repeating a gown? But imagine living in a world where those tiny mistakes meant your family's social future, your financial security, or even your chance at marriage. The pressure must have been unbearable. Of course, modern life isn't so different. We may not leave calling cards anymore, but we agonize over texts, emojis, and whether we've liked the wrong person's post. We don't fuss over seating charts at Astor's ball, but we do fret about where we sit in the office, or how many people followed us back. Our codes are digital now, but the anxiety feels strangely familiar. The Gilded Age reminds us that people will always invent systems, absurd, elaborate, and occasionally cruel, to separate themselves from others. Humans crave belonging, fear exclusion, and will spend fortunes to avoid being forgotten. In the end, the codes weren't about flowers or feathers. They were about survival. So if you'd lived through the Gilded Age, could you have mastered the hidden rules? Would you have thrived with the folded corners, the bouquets of coded messages, the tiaras heavy enough to cause a neck injury? Or would you have fled back to the countryside, happily forgotten but blissfully free from the tyranny of fans and florists? Either way, the lesson is clear. Beneath the silks and sequins, the Gilded Age was not about leisure. It was about strategy. And perhaps that's why we're still fascinated by it. Because even today, in our own digital ballrooms, we're still playing the same exhausting game. Until next time, sleep well, dream of candlelit ballrooms and perfectly folded calling cards. And I'll see you in the next story. Script written by Clara Finch, because good stories always deserve a soul.